Hey there, creative people. What's happening, buds? Welcome to the podcast. My name is Ryan Leacock, and this is the podcast for the eccentric and the opinionated. Today, I'm joined by podcaster Samantha Mashburn. She's the host and producer of the Mothball Prophecies. It's a podcast about people's collections, vintage, antique, and otherwise. She talks to people about the stories behind their collections. It's really a wonderful podcast. I've admired what they're doing over there for a long time. Samantha, she is a total pro. She's got this great podcast voice. She cares deeply about the mission behind her podcast. And it was really fantastic to get to know her and learn about her creativity and the aspects of her life that led her to starting her own podcast. It's really great stuff. This is the unofficial Halloween episode. We don't really talk about Halloween in the conversation, but Sam's place over Zoom, she lives in Idaho, was all decked with her cool vintage Halloween stuff. Which you can see at the podcasts at our YouTube channel. Some of the conversations that you can hear on the podcast, there are video versions of them with full video, and you can kind of, if you like to see people while they're talking, that's the space for you. So go check that out, and check out Sam's collection. It's pretty cool. How's everyone doing? I saw something cool this week. It's cool and weird. And I wanted to share with people on the podcast because I was talking earlier about, the fall being this time of creativity and why I love the fall so much. So I was watching Dancing with the Stars, and I love it, but it can be terrible, or can't be. This Monday, they did a horror movie night edition, and it was nothing short of inspired. So child star JoJo of JoJo Bo fame and dancer Jenna did a dance inspired by Stephen King's It, and it was fantastic. It was probably better than many Stephen King film adaptations. Also, and this was it just blew my mind. So Iman Shumpert from the NBA and Daniela, one of the dancers there, they do a dance inspired by the Jordan Peele film Us. Guys, it blew my mind. The end of it, I was just whoa. It's 9:00 on a Monday night on ABC, and I just thought, art. YouTube it, seriously, it was really great, and it just just made me smile and made my week. All right, well, that's enough for me. Enough bumper talk. Let's get into it with Samantha Mashburn of the Mothball Prophecies. We're going to do it together? Okay.
Yep. 1, 2, 3.
Didn't do it together.
It's okay. You want to try it again?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
There.
But it shows...
See?
Yeah.
Professional.
Thank you. Super professional. I also do a thing when we're recording and I need to cut the part without making any noises as I snap into the microphone, so it gives me a big line on my waveform.
Wow.
So that I go, oh, that's what I
right
needed
there.
to cut. That.
Oh my goodness, I should be focusing on these things and not everything else that I've been focusing.
No, because you do all of it. I don't have to focus generally on the audio stuff, and I just actually got yelled at because we were recording out of town, and so we didn't have our mic stands. Yeah. And we don't have super nice mics yet. I mean, they get the job done, but they transfer a lot of sound, right, all the way up. And my editor texted me, he's like, what the fuck were you doing? And I was like, well, I was having a beverage and recording. What else? In a hotel bed in my pajamas. So sorry.
Come on. We're making the best with what we have here.
I'm doing my best.
Well, as unprepared as I feel, I am a little bit prepared. I wore a vintage shirt.
I'm wearing one of my husband's vintage. It's a Nintendo shirt. So nice job.
Good one. Nice. I'm pretty excited about this. I've had you guys on my radar for a long time, but I feel like things have changed a little bit since. So I interviewed Mel
Dog,
Leather Mel, who's awesome. And then she was on your podcast. And then I listened to that. And so you guys have been kind of on my radar since then.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
You are so welcome. I've been looking forward to this. It's kind of nice to have the tables turned a little bit and not have to be the one to fully prepare for a show. So thanks. That's a treat.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad that I could connect us and have this conversation today. Sure. Well, how about we just jump into it? I'll have you introduce yourself. You can tell everyone what you do and where you're from. And then I'll just start firing some questions at you.
Perfect. Hi, I'm Samantha Mashburn, and I am a Jane of all trades, I guess some would say. I am a podcast host and executive producer for the Mothball Prophecies and a hairdresser by trade for the last 12 years. So creativity has been a part of my life from the beginning. I'm excited to be here today.
I love it. I love your podcast. I love what you're doing. Even this morning, I checked on it, and you were talking to someone. I'm terrible at details, but you're talking to someone about their shirts and like vintage horror stuff. And then I'm like getting dressed. I'm like, oh, I have a vintage shirt. I'm gonna wear it.
Yeah, it was, we get this question a lot with people that are going to be on our show. And they're like, the first thing they say is, I don't have anything interesting to talk about. And the second thing they say is, I don't really have any collections. And I'm like, everybody has a collection. It doesn't have to be vintage. It doesn't have to be antique. I'm like, I want to know, I love the stories behind why people collect and what they collect versus the value or size or internet popularity of what they collect. And it was really cool to have him on because he collects all like a certain type of vintage tea. It's printed in it's called discharge, so you can't fill any of the ink. And he collects living dead dolls, those like horror themed dolls.
I love it. I didn't realize another thing is that when did you kind of, like, you started out with antiques and everything, right? And have you expanded as you went, or was that always like the goal?
Yeah, when we started last year, I thought that I had like my collections dialed all the way in. Like I thought that everything that I was going to collect was going to be what I was going to collect forever. And like the best example of it is like what's behind me, which is my uranium glass, which it doesn't show up well on film, but I did not have any pieces of that last year, and now I have probably 20. So yeah, I guess it started with like what I loved all the time, which was like miniatures and some Pyrex and like the regular run-of-the-mill vintage stuff, right? I've always had an affinity for it. And now it's like every week we talk to somebody new about what they collect, and it like peels back this layer of the vintage world. And I'm like, well, shit, now I have to find that too. So now it's become problematic in like the best way, right? I don't know.
And that's such an organic way to kind of like expand like outside of antique shops and everything, is like you get curious about stuff, like, and then you're like, oh, I want to know more about that. That sounds so cool. And
then when you're out, like if you're at a thrift store or a garage sale or something, and you see something that like either sells for a lot or is really collectible, and like it's almost like you put on like this vintage poker face, you're just like, I don't know what that is. Right? You just grab it and put it in. And now I keep like different stuff in my car for when I bring home like breakables. Like I always have packing paper and like it's really changed a lot of what I do now.
It's such a natural like topic for podcasts. I mean, like even yesterday, my wife was saying she was at a garage sale and she saw this rug and it was like $60, but then she saw this other guy like gave it the eyes, and then she's like, well, I'm not fucking getting rid of this then,
right?
And like, like that's a little anecdote that I could tell you, but you just like made it a podcast.
And it, where it started initially, I've always loved stories of people, right? I've always loved to listen to people talk. My grandfather was a wonderful storyteller. And so I've always been captivated by people's lives and what makes them who they are, right? In any capacity. And doing hair for so long, for 12 years, I have to have conversations with people in a meaningful way all day long, or it gets really hard. And you learn a lot about people's lives, and you learn a lot about different scenarios that got them to where they are. And I started this antique study group in 2018. I started going to it, and I'm like the youngest by like 50 years. It was seriously, Ryan, you had to be like, to get in, somebody either had to die or age out of the group. And you have to have like a sponsor to get in. Like, it's a very serious deal.
I think that's because you guys are American.
Yeah.
Fly up here.
No. Well, and it was because they were like, the group capacity, I think, is at 21 or 22. These women don't want any more people than that in their houses. Like, they don't have room for them.
Okay.
So the first time I went, I was, I have tattoos and red hair, and I'm like sitting there, and they're all looking at me like, what could she possibly know? And
oh my gosh.
I sat and listened to them, because one person gives a program every month. That's what the thing is. And the first one I went to, somebody was giving a program on cufflinks, which seemed pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
But it wasn't necessarily the item she was showing, but she was talking about how like 4 or 5 pairs of these cufflinks had been in her family for over 100 years. And like some of them were Tiffany's, and some of them were wedding presents, or like all of these things. And I just remember thinking like, their families don't know these stories about these items, which is why like some kids don't care about their parents' collectibles, because they don't know the history behind it. They just see it as something they couldn't touch. It was breakable. It's not a toy. Yeah. So that's where it started, really, was like, all of these stories are going to be lost to time. How do we capture these? So the original concept for the Mothball Prophecies was just going to be those women. And then the pandemic happened.
Oh, wow.
And you couldn't be around elderly people.
Oh my gosh.
So
I love it. That is a great story.
thanks. Yeah. So that pivot was like, okay, I guess we'll just reach out to strangers on the internet.
So you're young compared to these ladies, right? So you're
Yeah.
like in this group for life now? Like as long, like I guess when
Yeah.
it starts back up, I don't know what's happening now.
Yeah. We're back. We just met
Okay.
for our first meeting in, August. And then I actually hosted last month. Everybody was in my house and I did it on uranium glass. And yeah, so we just met, and now I think I'm trapped for life because I'm the secretary, and I also taught them how to look things up on their phone with Google Lens to like identify stuff. And now I will get like emails, not text messages, emails of being like, "Hey Sam, can you help me look this up? I'm at a party," and they'll send me a couple of pictures. It's very sweet. It's very sweet.
So much has changed in like a year, almost 2 years. That's insane. They went from like, "Who is this person in my house?" to, "Hey, can you look this up for me and teach me how to use my technology?" I love that.
Yeah, it's really sweet and endearing. And I'm just, stoked to have like, and I worked in a retirement home for a while too. So I generally love old people. They just are so cool and they have the best stories. I love that I get to know these women outside the capacity of being a mom or an aunt or a grandma. I know them as the person that they actually are. It's really nice.
That's awesome. Literally though, you've been like training for this. You were working in old age homes. You've been cutting hair, and talking with people is like a lot harder than like I thought. Well, I don't know. I can talk to some people, or I can't talk to them at all. You know what I mean? Like we have something to talk about, but if I met you at a party, you'd be like, "Why is he being so weird?"
Well, but then I'm the person that goes like, "So Ryan, what do you do? Like, do you?" And then I just start throwing interests out because that's what I have to do behind the chair to be like,
exactly.
Yeah, it's a learned skill for sure. I've always worked customer service, and so you just kind of, and then there's some people that just don't talk, and it took me a long time to get over like taking that personally and just being like, oh, I guess we're not going to talk. So now I was like, do you want to listen to a podcast? Like, you want to put your headphones in and I'll just work? Like we did our consultation. And that literally is like, it's so nice when somebody's like, yeah, I don't want to talk at all. Like a mom, she's like, I just want to sit here. And I'm like, cool beans. Let's do that.
And they're probably like, oh, thank God. I just need silence.
Yeah. And I'm like, I get it, man. I get it. I have a almost 4-year-old. So when I'm out of the house, my brain is just like, shh.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I've noticed since I started doing this is that like it does make talking to people so much easier, and it's made my life better though. Like I didn't realize before. I'm like, it sounds terrible. It's just easier to be like friendly and chatty with people, and people treat you better and stuff. And I'm like, well, thanks podcast. You taught me how to be a slightly better person.
Right. And it does. That's a good point too. And have you noticed that like it makes you more engaged too in conversation because you're used to now like listening to answers and kind of jumping off of that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's made even though I've talked to people for so long, it's made the conversations I start a little bit better and easier because I know just some different aspects, I guess. I don't know now.
Yeah. For me, it's like a lot of like, I just follow my gut, like I'm like, oh, pay attention to this and, or whatever. And just kind of, I like make little notes, but it's certainly been so much better. So, okay. We talked about like the fridge podcast stuff. Sam, you have identified yourself early on as like a creative person cutting hair, starting this podcast. Where did that start for you?
Oh man, I think that my family would say that I have always been eccentric and opinionated and kind of beating my own drum and doing my own things, whether that was like clothing or style or music or I remember being creative from like, I would say 4 years old, like just whether it was making art or singing or being in theater or anything like that. I have always felt a kind of freedom and I don't know, I feel best when I'm being creative. So it's always been kind of a safe place to go to like weed through whatever I need to weed through, whatever that creativity is. And it, when I was going to school, because I do have such like an artistic brain, I really struggled with like common concepts, right? Like math was really hard for me. And then it's funny now, I look back on it because I was recently diagnosed with ADHD, which makes a lot of sense. And so I look back now at school a little differently, knowing that I was just struggling comprehensively. I have a wicked photographic memory. I do not write down any of my color formulas behind the chair unless they're really tricky. And I can just see it and I know, and that's just how my brain always has been. So naturally, as I was going through high school and kind of deciding what I was going to go to college for, I knew I wanted to do hair because I was good at it and the possibilities of creativity were pretty endless. And so I went to beauty school right out of high school and I started, we call it booth renting here. I started booth renting at 19 years old and I'm 31 now.
Wow.
And that,
like you were going for it, like right out of the gate.
Yeah. I don't necessarily have like a slow, like stop and go. It's kind of like all or nothing with most everything that I do. And I wanted to have a career and I wanted to have my own money. And I was just like, well, I guess this is what I have to do. And 19-year-old me is a lot braver than 31-year-old me because she didn't have like a house payment and a car payment and all of that stuff. My mom is super creative. And so I kind of just grew up with like, she crafted and I had my own stuff, craft supplies. Like it was just always around me.
Always around you.
Yeah.
Did you find that difficult in school though? Was there ever a moment where you're like, okay, I can remember things so well, but I can't figure out this math stuff? Like,
yeah, there was a couple things that kind of led up to it. Was I had epilepsy in my teenage years. I grew out of it.
Oh, wow.
But it was missed for like the initial stages of puberty. So like all through 5th grade, I probably had it and wasn't diagnosed. So the reason math was so difficult is my brain did not catalog the important steps in an algebraic equation. Yeah. So I would be in like algebra and I would think I had the problem right. And I had missed like 3 key steps, right? So it's just like AB equals Z. Like it was not. And then my grandma was the one that noticed it. She was teaching me how to crochet and we would get all the way through a pattern. And then I'd go, how do you start a chain again? What's the next thing that I do?
Yeah.
And so she was the one that brought it up. And that's what started changing it. So the math I did understand, which lends well to my career, was geometry. I really understood that and it made sense in my brain.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I like that you didn't seem to hold you back anyway. You're like, okay, well, I'm going to focus on this then.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of the reason I chose hair too, was I had all my math credits to graduate. Yeah. And so I took my last math class in my sophomore year of high school because I was like, this is miserable. I can't do this. Yeah. I'm not going to need it. And so I talked to my mom and she was like, okay, because she saw me struggle. And once I got rid of it, I was like, thank God. Now I can be done with that.
I think that's a big part of growing up is like shedding all those things. Like, thank God that's over with. Let's be myself now.
Right. I'm not going to do that ever again. Yeah, it was. And thank God my mom did not force me to like continue with math. She was also probably miserable too because she was like, God, she just is not doing well.
She had her own thank God after you like walked other. Oh God. So then the podcast thing. So you're doing hair and you're kind of training and learning how to talk with people. Have you always been social?
Yeah, I've always been a super social person. I'm not nervous really in front of crowds. If it's a crowd of 1,000 strangers, totally fine. If it's 500 people that I know intimately, I will probably throw up. Like it's just, I don't know what, like it's that difference. And I did like theater and stuff in high school and I taught as an educator for a hair care company for 6 years. So I was going kind of all over the place and teaching in front of strangers and, so it was just, I guess, something that I just had to get over if I was ever scared of it.
Yeah. And then how did podcasting start? Like,
I started listening to podcasts in probably 2017, 2018, maybe 2016, as it was starting to like take off, I guess, in the sense of like you were seeing media coverage of other types of podcasts. Of course, I started in the true crime genre like lots of people do.
Yeah.
And I started out that way. And then I didn't have like any inkling of like, I should start my own. Cause I'm like, what do I start a podcast about?
Yeah.
And then I started that antique study group in 2018 and I had mentioned it to a girl I work with and she's now my copywriter. And so she does a lot of the background stuff for me. Her name's Spellcheck. And I mentioned it to her and I was like, I think I want to do this, but I'm like, I don't know how the fuck you do that. And this was, pre-pandemic, BC before COVID. And so I was like, I don't know how to do that. It's just a dream. Right.
Yeah.
And, it just kind of started to like snowball from there. I kept thinking of different ways to make it happen. And I had talked to the women in the antique study group about it and they were like, what's a podcast? And I'm like, it's kind of like talk radio, but not, and they're like, well, and I said, there's no obligation. And I talked to them about, some of them seemed really excited and some of them were like, probably not. And then I was like, well, I can't do this by myself. I need a co-host. And then I was like, who's going to be as insane about this as I am and like dedicate the time necessary? Because it's a lot of time. And I asked a friend that I know that, you kind of wonder why people keep like slamming into your life when you don't know them. You wouldn't really have any interest in particular. And I asked my co-host Jill if she would be my co-host. We were actually headed to an estate sale, and that was in 2019. And I said, okay, we'll give it the winter to like think and, you know, put some stuff in order. And then we were going to launch in May of 2020. Yeah. And I don't know about you, but like I researched stuff to death, and I just started reading a bunch of like blogs and Reddit posts, and I joined a bunch of different Facebook groups to look over. I'm like, where do you start and what equipment do you use and how do you worry about like licensing stuff? And I just really went down the rabbit hole, and like the last thing to tie up was the editing, and I was working on that and then luckily found my editor. But yeah, it kind of just started as like this natural curiosity because I've done hair for such a long time. I feel like I've reached kind of not necessarily the end, but there's not a lot of new things to discover. So then my brain kind of goes like, well, what's the next thing we can do?
Yeah. Obsess about and spend a lot of time and money on.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure.
So you started like literally when the pandemic was starting, that's when you guys started, like when you started.
Yeah, we were going to be in May, and then we were like, well, like, and I didn't work for 10 weeks. Like I couldn't work because salons were non-essential. And so for the first time in my adult life, I was like at home. And then that's what really started to shift my perspective on what I want, you know, out of life. And that's when I took the podcast, instead of being like a hobby, it turned into more of how do I make this work as potentially a career and a job. So I started to take it a little bit more seriously during the pandemic because I had, you know, outside of being home with my son, I had a lot of time to work through any issues or any hiccups. Yeah. And that's when we started reaching out to people that I had as friends, like Melissa and my friend Carrie, who was our first episode. And then literally just messaging people and hoping like they weren't going to look at the fact that we were just starting and be like, and luckily that was not the case. So yeah, that's where I got a little bit more serious about how I was going to take it as a hobby.
It's crazy how that pandemic, like, I think in 10 years, there's going to be so many stories of just like, because everyone will know them. I think we're talking to people all the time, so I think we're seeing it. But I think most people, when they look back, they're like, oh yeah, everyone kind of just, it changed everything. Yeah. You know, it focused a lot of things.
Yeah, it was a lot of like the unnecessary things in my life that I was holding on to because I thought it was an absolute. I got rid of them. I used it as an opportunity to, when I got back behind the chair, I set all of the boundaries I should have set when I started. But when you're starting, you need to make money, you know, and I got rid of people that were not fun to be around and just, you know, like dialed everything all the way back into what I needed to be successful for myself rather than outwardly successful. Yeah, it was, I liken it to, I had this woman as a client. She's since passed away, but she had polio as a kid at like 4 years old. Oh my gosh. And she was 92 when she died. And she still did things from the polio epidemic that were like idiosyncrasies of what she had to do then, right? So people didn't get polio. Yeah. So she still washed every vegetable and every piece of fruit, whether it was in a peel or not, like a banana, everything like that. Like there were so many things that she did because of, and I often wonder like what's going to carry over for us, right? And we'll be 90-year-olds and they'll be like, oh my God, you don't have to stand 6 feet away from me, or, you know, something like that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And like the kids too, she was 4 years old. So it's like, it was right in her, like, I'm learning how life works, right? Like, we both have kids and it's hard to see them kind of go through this. We have the luxury of being like, I'm going to use this as an opportunity for growth. Kids are like, what? The world's like this? That's fucked up.
Yeah. And people like my son will be 4. And during the height of the pandemic, he was 2.5. And he didn't go to a park until he was 3.
Yeah.
You know, like he was still, you know, he still went to daycare at the end of the year, but I didn't take him to the grocery store with me because he couldn't wear a mask. Like I didn't. Yeah. And so now, like when he goes to the grocery store, he's like, this place is fucking great. How long have we had these? What's going on? Yeah. It's an interesting. Yeah.
My daughter, she just went into grade 1 and she had a hard time adjusting to grade 1. And at first I was like, come on, we've been waiting to get back in school and all this. And she was so excited. But then I switched gears and I was like, you really lost your kindergarten because they canceled school like 3 times and And then it was just like, you know what, whatever you get, like, if you got to stay home today, like, I'm just going to help you get through this, because we have nothing in our childhood that we can even relate with this. Right.
No. And it's traumatic for them too, because they don't have like the emotional capacity to assign what they're feeling
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
it. They don't understand like what those feelings are, that they're sad that they're not seeing their friends or going to school or
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
of those things. So it results in, behaviors that are unsavory, but you have to be like, fuck, I'm sorry, man.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's been interesting.
And during all of this, you pivoted and you started talking to people that you know. Do you have plans to talk to these ladies? Like the initial plans?
I think some of them maybe have listened to the show and maybe don't say fuck so much in real life. And we do tailor it to each guest, right? Whatever guest we have on the show, we ask like, hey, we cuss, and they'll generally, sometimes people will go, oh, fuck yeah. And then some people will be like, yeah, I don't really cuss in my real life. Like if we could keep it, I want my family to listen to this. And it's like, okay, that's no problem. And so I do want some of them to be on the show, but I think some of them are like, I don't know. I think they don't know. Yeah. So I take my time to like share their stories on the show sometimes without using their names, to be like, this interesting thing happened, or so there's a couple people that I definitely do want to talk to that I think would sit down, that they're very interesting. But I think most of them would be pretty uncomfortable with it at this point. Yeah.
Sometimes I drop a fuck early in the conversation, and then if they throw in swear words after, I'm like, okay, I can keep swearing.
Here we go.
If they don't, then I just kind of dial it back.
Well, I think too, it goes with where I'm from. Like where I live is super conservative and is kind of dominated by one religion in general. So like the harshest word you'll hear out of some people's mouth is like frick, or like, oh my gosh, or what so it's like if we have somebody on that's really local, I generally ask more than if it's somebody I've followed on social media and I definitely know they say fuck in real life. Yeah. So it's the same rule applies behind the chair. I just kind of, I'll be like shit, and I'll be like, okay, we're good. We're good.
I grew up Christian, so I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So you're talking to people. That beginning, like, reach out is like during that first 10 episodes, you feel like such a burden. Like, can you talk on my podcast? Like, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You just feel like a weirdo.
Yeah, it was a huge lesson of like letting go and just like putting yourself out there in a way that's so terrifying. And then just like hands up, like, okay, this is all right. I'm just going to handle this, and like doing that really scary thing and like, over apologizing, being like, sorry to take up so much time and all, And then I just had to look at it as like, I'm just going to ask these people, if they say no, they say no. Like, and let the email go, and just be okay with it. But yeah, initially starting out, especially, I was like, how do you reach out to somebody that make it sound like legit and you're not just, And so initially, we usually reach out to people on Instagram, and I just send a message, and it's usually, I try to keep it short, to just be like, hey, I have this podcast. You have a great collection. We'd love to talk to you about it. Here's kind of what we do. But yeah, it was the imposter syndrome from starting the show. I forget about it, but it was terrifying. Like leading up to the launch of the show, when you've done, the little bit of press and there's been a little bit of movement, and you're like a week out, then you start to realize like, I don't have control of this once it's out in the ether. Like I don't have the control or a way to help somebody interpret it, or a way that somebody's going to take it. And when we were starting, we were both just like, are we doing the right thing? This is terrifying. And it was, for both my co-host and I, we work in the public. She's a nurse, and, there's a certain way you act around people when you're at work, right? You're professional and all of those things. There's certain things you don't talk about. And we wanted to make sure that on the show we were as authentic as possible. So it was also like putting yourself out there in a way that there's really no facade was one of the scariest things I've ever done.
It's weird how you don't realize that you're kind of not hiding, but you're just being a different person, like when you're at work, and then I'm so glad you brought that up, because when you start up the podcast, you want to connect. So you like, I have to be vulnerable here. And you're like, oh, I have to be vulnerable. And I kind of forgot about it too. And like, no one else is going through it with you. They're all like living their regular lives. And you're like, I'm feeling like I'm putting myself out there, but it's and then you feel weird for feeling weird about it, because it's like, well, what's this? I have 10 followers. Like, you know what I mean? Especially at the beginning when you're going through all that craziness.
Yeah. And then now I'm reminded of it because somebody will be working through the backlog and I'll get an Instagram message of like a joke I made. And I'm like, oh my God. And I just like, I'm like, because you get comfortable speaking with somebody, right? And you forget that there's going to be other people listening because it's usually just you and the guest. And so, you know, and I try to make them feel comfortable with being like, oh yeah, I had that same experience, or I share something personal. And then I was just like, I just have to get over that and realize that like if one person hears a part of my life that maybe they only thought they had, that's helpful. You know, if somebody hears that, whatever it is, you know, whatever anecdote or whatever. But yeah, it was really terrifying. And then, you know, when you're starting and everything's just low, numbers are low, followers are low, and nobody knows about you. Yeah. Then you're just kind of going like, you know, I don't know. It's so much stuff that goes on in your head of this like reverberation of like imposter syndrome and nonsense, and just to work through it was,
my ego would go like, so like I'd get like so full of myself. I'd be like, oh man, this is going, and then the next like half an hour later it could be, I'm like, what the fuck am I doing? This is so stupid. Why did I start this thing? Mm-hmm. But it's really over, like, it's in the first like few hundred that you're going through like the biggest waves of it, I found. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you're going through like, you know, when in the beginning I was like obsessive about watching numbers every week, right? And like seeing like, who is this? And then, you know, and then those I just had to like, I look at them once a week, maybe every 2 weeks, because if I look at them all the time and I'm like, I get too in my head about it, and I'm like, you know what? If these, however many people are listening every week, then I hope they're enjoying it. I hope that, you know, I would rather have genuine connection with my listeners than numbers correlating to like popularity. I would rather have, you know, the consistent numbers of people coming back and just being like, okay, I know that they get it. Those people get it. And that's all that it's worth. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can't control much more than that, you know? Mm-mm. Like that's the thing that I found peace in. It was like, well, when I was stressed, I got through that, and I didn't really, all that stress didn't really add to like the numbers and all that. Mm-hmm. They're all here despite that. So well, whatever. I guess it's a nice rest when you finally get there of just like, this is what it is. And it doesn't mean I'm not going to try to make it grow or whatever. It's just like, I can only do so much, and this is what I do well. Like, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. And did you find also that like every time you would step outside of what you were genuinely after was when you felt like you did your shittiest work, rather than just being like, this is what I want my show to be. This is how I want to interact with it?
I think it's just in my head. I don't know if it really affected the show, but maybe in terms of like trying to promo it or trying to like the actual content of the show, I don't think it's really changed that much. Yeah. It's just this, right? But in terms of how I promote it, and then like I remember I did a giveaway like early on, and I don't think anyone like shared or anything, and I was like, I'm a fucking lie. Like, I've lied to myself. This is nothing. Mm-hmm. I like a crisis about it, but then you get over it. You're like, oh, it's not nothing. It's just not a big deal. Right.
And I don't ever enter giveaways because I never win anything. So I'm just like, good luck to everybody that's here in the comments. Good luck. Yeah. I see you. Yeah. It was, and you know, I talked about it. Actually, I was just interviewed by another podcast, and I talked about how it was like last year I went through such a metamorphosis of finding out like who I really am behind all of the masking techniques and being, you know, whatever somebody thinks I should be, and just working through that. And I can genuinely say like the show was such a huge aspect. It was like cathartic to like figure out who I am, and then to have these people embrace it was so nice. Yeah. Like it's like a reward to just be like, oh.
And then you get to like do that with other people too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's where it gets kind of like cool. It's like, no matter what, where are you from? Like what state are you from?
I live in Idaho, born and raised here. Yeah. We live in the southeastern corner. Growing up in Idaho, it's really like where I'm from is a super rural town. Like growing up, you know, you have like your bullies or whatever, and you think like those people still like track you. And I guess if they do, like good for them. But that was another hurdle to get over when like starting the show was like, are those people going to find it and then just be mean? But that didn't happen. That didn't happen at all.
That is like a next level bully. They're like, fuck this person for life.
I'm going to keep finding them. I'm going to send them mean tweets.
I'm going to show up at their job. I'm going to, hey, you suck.
Mm-hmm. God, I really don't do a lot of people from my hometown, which is not an accident. Because it's a small town and it's just like little chickens running around, right, to everybody's roost.
It is weird though. Like the person that people knew you in high school, or you have to confront, this is who I am now, and I'm putting that out there in that small, because when you're starting out again, it's that small scale thing. I love that you brought it up though, because when you go through it, you're like, I think am I the only one? Like,
yeah. And then
podcasting is weird.
Like talking to people that have a similar interest in you is a really nice thing to like have good conversations about people.
Yeah.
And I had the craziest experience on Friday. I was out with a friend. We were having a couple of drinks and we had walked in front of a group of people to go into a bar, and then we're leaving. And this person, he reached up and he goes, wait, he's like, I think I know you. And I like looked at him and I was like, and I was wearing a hat. I usually wear a hat.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't think I know you. And he knew my co-host Jill. And he goes, he's like, you're Sam from the Mothball Prophecies, right? He's like, I have your face on my phone. And I just literally like turned into a snail. I was like, what? And he was like, yeah. And then he just went straight into his collectibles, which is what happens now. People will be like, you have this podcast, listen to my cool shit. And then they info dump about their vintage. And I love it. And he'll be like, I was at a sale and I found this piece for like $3. And and then he like looking at his friends, he goes, this is the podcast. And I was like, oh my God. I'm like, thanks. But yeah. So now it's cool because now if people know that I do the show, they just talk to me about their vintage. And I really like that.
Yeah. It's like, we should just start recording this podcast right now.
Yeah, right now. Hold on. Let me get my phone out. Here's I just carry my recording equipment.
We'll do a mini one right here.
Yeah. Hold on. Do you want to go in the bathroom? It's quieter in there. It's less to edit.
It's like, it's funny when you said that though, because I was like I have a fairly, the thing I collect is like, I'm a big movie guy. Mm-hmm. So I have like, I don't know, I haven't counted them in a long time because I'm not a numbers person, but it's like 500-600 DVDs that I've mounted to the wall.
Wow.
Yeah, like I made shelves for them all. But now I don't watch any of them because almost everything's on streaming. And but I consider them like my backup. Like I'm like, yeah, it exists in the world. It's up there, even if I can't find it in the digital world. Well,
if your Wi-Fi's out.
Yeah, exactly.
You got to go back to the caveman technology.
And like, we're bordering on apocalypse. So, I'm going to start a new Blockbuster as soon as when we cross over that line, I'm like, here, I got a DVD player. You can borrow that. And you can borrow these movies. I'm prepared. See? But I almost launched into it as soon as we started talking. Like I had that same impulse to be like, oh, I want to tell her about my collection.
Yeah. So do you like stick into like the same genre, or do you run the gamut of movies to collect? And
I just I like buying like anything. And in fact, like I've gotten like, I still buy like nice editions of things. Like I got 4 kids, so superhero movies and everything are a big deal in our house. If a new one comes out, I'll buy them. But I know what I've been liking lately, like find the old ones that are like I bought Blade, the first Blade.
Oh, nice.
On DVD and with like one of the fold cases that you have to pop. And it was all like beat up, but the disc played fine. And I was like, I think this is a better experience than buying the special edition of this because where has this been? I'm watching it with the menus that someone made in like 1997. You know, like, so it's this little time capsule. I kind of like it because it's authentic. It's like, this is how someone would have watched it if they bought it in 1997. But I get to watch it on my big TV and I just like it. That's my collection now. It used to be pretty serious, but now I like Blade on bad DVD.
Well, and it's, my husband still buys VHS. Like if we're out somewhere and he sees a movie we grew up with, I used to give him so much shit. And now the VHS market is really growing in popularity.
Yeah.
And so there's times that like I'll get a tape out and now I have to like tell my son, like, don't rip this apart, please, for the love of God. Like, don't stick anything in the VCR. But yeah, no, we have just that like expansive VHS collection. It's not displayed anywhere because of our toddler, but yeah, I get it.
Yeah, I love it. And I haven't I'm going to stop. See, this is, I guess, so at what point were you like, I guess you were in the class. Sorry, what did you call it? It was a antique study group?
Yes, antique study group.
That's amazing. I didn't know that existed. But I guess at some point you're having all these conversations. Like I can even stop myself right now that you're like, okay, someone has to start recording these things. Is that kind of how it.
And it was the story that I guess pushed it over my brain is to be like, as a daughter and a granddaughter, like that story would have changed my perspective on something in my grandmother's kitchen. And we were sitting in a woman's house, and she had done her program on kitchenware, right? So everything from utensils to gadgets to the starting out of silverware, right? A fork and a knife, and why like a butter knife or a knife at a table doesn't have a point on it generally. And that comes all the way back from like medieval times, so that people didn't stab each other at dinner. Like it was like, hey, this is your eating knife, not your fighting knife. Like don't fuck around. And so she was going through all of the history of it, right? And they're talking. And then at the end of the program, if people want, like they can bring an item that's related to the program and then share their story about it.
Yeah.
So this woman she was talking about a silver platter that she grew up with, like an 18-inch silver platter, and how her grandmother, and she describes this woman as like a large woman with strong features and a strong body. And she was a workhorse, right? She really provided what she could for her family. And she describes this person as hand making meringue, right, on this silver platter. So she had cracked the egg whites over it, put the sugar over it, and then she started to whip it with the fork in these great big, I just hit my mic stand, in these great big circles, right? And making meringue on a platter. And the way she was telling the story was so beautiful and reverent, as like a moment she was so proud to be related to this person. And I went, oh my God, it's all tied back to what somebody would just walk past in the store, a silver platter, right?
Yeah.
But the significance, and then for instance, somebody just brought, it was on silver, and somebody brought a silver spoon that was her husband's grandmother's or her husband's mother's. And it was her spoon she used to cook all of the time, so much so that part of the side of the spoon had degraded.
Yeah.
And it was like, so it was those stories that I started to hear that I just was like, wow, this makes the collection so much more interesting. Because I don't know that I've met anybody that collects something because it's valuable or because it like, some people collect stuff because it looks cool. Like I have stuff that looks cool. But if I hear the story behind something, I'm more likely to keep it. Like if I find family pictures or things like that at a sale, I just buy them to like take them home. Or find something that seems special. We call it antique foster care. Like I'm just like, I'll keep you with me until you go to your forever home, you know? And so that's what it was, the importance of, my grandpa had asked me when I was, in high school, because he knew I liked to tell stories and listen. He says, I want you to be our family historian. I want to tell you these stories so you remember them and you pass them on.
Yeah.
And so that love for storytelling just naturally transitioned into like, I got to save these somehow. And, my end goal for the show, no matter how much money it makes or how much acclaim or wherever it goes, my end goal, because the internet is forever. So in 50 years from now, I want somebody to be looking up their past family member, right? And putting it into whatever search engine is the thing. And then seeing that there's an audio story from their family member. And my hope is that they will listen and hear the stories that I listened to in this group.
Yeah.
And feel some comfort or feel some familiarity for whatever. Like it's somebody's own personal prophecy that's also in the lineage of my podcast is what I hope for.
Yeah. I guess it's prophecy because you're thinking about the future. I love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why do you think that's so important to you? Like, why do you think that you're like, I have to do this. I have to take on, and this is...
I would say, like, I know exactly what caused it. And it was both of my grandfathers died pretty suddenly and pretty tragically. And so as you grow older, right, you want to ask them questions and you want to ask them things, the history of things or their history or what they were like as a kid, like outside of them just being a family member, like who they are as a real person. Yeah. And I lost one grandfather at 4 years old that I just never knew and only know stories about. And then my other grandfather died. He had dinner with my grandma, and then 30 minutes later, he had like a stroke and he was gone. And it was right before his first book was going to be published, So it was like there was all these things that I still wanted to ask him about life and his opinions, and I didn't get the chance to do that. So now I feel like I have this like insatiable hunger to know the important parts of somebody's story before I don't have the chance to know them anymore. That's where it comes from for me, of just being like, I get this opportunity with you again. And so one of the first things I did when I had recording equipment was record an episode with my grandma Because I was like, I want to know who you were before you were my grandma and before you were my mom's mom. Like, what did you like and I guess it's purely selfish of just wanting to know information. I've always been a snoop, like the snoopiest fucking person ever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always have to know where stuff is and why it works and how it works. Like my aunt, I used to babysit for her, and she would call me and she'd be like, "Hey, do you remember where I put this lotion in my house?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's under the sink in your bathroom behind your blow dryer." And then it's like, hello, that's ADHD brain, the hyperfixation on stuff. So yeah, I guess that's my whole reasoning for the show, is just to know those important bits that maybe nobody else in your life is asking you about.
Yeah. It is weird to have that with some people. You're probably having, not everyone has like deep conversations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with some people, you might be having one of those conversations and their family has never really had that conversation with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why do you think stuff is so important to all this though? Like when I think about stuff, you hear a lot about people getting rid of stuff right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, especially a couple of years ago with Marie Kondo and stuff. How do you feel about all that? Like, when you hear about that, what's your take?
I think it's such a big question, because I feel like there's several different reasons that people have things, right? I think a lot of it is maybe your own worth or your basis around material things, which we all do.
Yeah.
I think some people have stuff because it's soothing, and the act of buying and purchasing something feels good. I think that people get rid of stuff for the same reason. I think they get rid of things that aren't serving them in any type of capacity, whether it's nice to look at or any type of thing like that. And I think too, it's a lot of like, we tell a lot of our own personal stories with the things we buy, whether we share it with somebody or not, like why you really buy something or what it invokes in you.
Yeah.
And so I think, and that's what is interesting to me about people's collections, is when I walk into their house and I see something that maybe I wouldn't expect them to have, I'll go like, oh, I'm like, what is this? And they'll just be like, oh, it just makes me laugh. And then, that's where the story thing comes into play. But I think we like collectively are just like squirrels and magpies. Like, we're just like, this is nice. Let's have this. I like this soft blanket from Costco. Let's take it home. I think we're just generally at the end of it, just like materialistic.
Yeah. Some people aren't though. Some people are like anti stuff. How do you feel about that?
I find it interesting because they still will have interesting stuff, right? They're anti stuff in the capacity, but generally if they are buying something, it's like maybe mondo expensive. Like I have a friend that is a minimalist, and I would like go to her house and I'm just like, where is everything? And she comes to my house, she's like, why do you have everything? Like, it's just, how it makes you feel to have all of those things, but her taste is exceptional, right? Like I wish I could just have like 4 things in a room, but I am a maximalist until the day I die, because stuff brings me peace. Like I just like looking at pretty things all day long. The only issue I ever run into with what stuff people have or they don't have is when somebody wants to have a negative conversation on either side of the board. Like if somebody wants to be like, oh, I don't, I could never, or how could you, or whatever. It's just like, let somebody have their joy. Yeah. Only, obviously this is leading into like, if it is a healthy collecting and not hoarding, and, if it is hoarding, seek out some therapy to deal with what you're soothing when you collect.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's like anything, right? Like just because someone is using it to like fill a hole and it's getting out of control, that doesn't mean that we're not also using it to fill a hole. It's just it's in control.
Yeah, everybody does it in some. What did I hear the other day? Somebody said if you have a collection and it's on display, it's not hoarding. But if it's starting to pile up in a room and nobody sees it, it's probably hoarding. And I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So like if you're like borderline hoarder, just like start displaying it and you'll stay fine. You'll be okay.
Build a shelf.
Give
yourself a checklist.
I built a few, yeah.
Yeah, put it on display. That's what I hear.
Whatever you want to do. Have you always had a connection with stuff? Like, have things always mattered to you?
Yeah, and I think that comes from just growing up really poor. Growing up, my mom was a single mom. My parents got divorced when I was young, and she stayed home with us for a long time before she went back to work. So going to the thrift store and going to garage sales was not like, let's see what fun things we find. It was like my mom turning it in, and she, I have to commend her because I never knew that we were poor. if we go to the thrift store, she'd give you like $5 or $10 and be like, "Okay, go find an outfit." But it also had to pass the check of like, looking presentable. But there was lots of stuff that we went and found secondhand because that was what we could afford. Like growing up, I would just find little treasures, right? That looked, I don't know that I was necessarily looking for things that looked expensive, but they looked different and they were my own, and we saved everything growing up. And, we worked, like if I wanted to make money to go do something, I would go to my grandparents' house and work. And like, you were never supposed to ask how much you were going to make. You just went and worked. And my grandma had lots of collections. So like in your brain, you just see the people in your life, like that's what success is. If I have porcelain china, that is, I have made it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it most definitely started as a way of like just necessity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like things like the way I kind of describe my like of things is like there's like life in this thing. Mm-hmm. Some things don't have any. I mean, maybe if you heard the story about them and that's what gives them life. Mm-hmm. But whenever I'm attracted to something, I'm like, there's something in this that's like more than the thing it is. Mm-hmm. And there's something like, it's just like, I own this little piece of, it's like creative energy or just like, it's like a little, like a piece of energy. You know what I mean?
Yeah. We always feel like, and we've noticed it as the shows progress and we talk to more people, is there's a calling to a certain piece that you find, right? And sometimes you'll pick something up and you're like, I do really like this, but it just doesn't feel like it's supposed to be mine.
Yeah.
And you leave it for somebody else to find. But yeah, that's definitely a thing where you feel called to something, whatever it is, to take it home.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I think we're sensitive people, right? And we'll see something and we'll just connect with it. And you feel, it's no longer an object or just something sitting on the shelf. It feels like it has to belong in your space and it has to belong as a part of your story for right now.
Yeah, you're like out and you're like, this has to come with me on my journey now. Yeah.
Yeah. Like we have this, we say stupid little idiot a lot on the show, and that's generally referring to like some type of vintage that's like so stupid it's cute, right? And the most stupid little idiot I've ever found was this beat up wax candle that's of a mouse, and it's like eyes have been like scratched off and it's got a bunch of dents, but it was at the thrift store for 3 weeks in the same spot, and I saw it every time, and on the third week I just went, okay, I'll take you home. And now I have this beat up fucking mouse candle, but I just look at him and I'm like, you're here, it's fine, you're safe now, no toddler's gonna scratch your eyes out anymore.
It's so comforting to talk like this. People don't talk about, like, you don't have a general conversation about stuff with regular people like this. And it's like nice. You're like, oh, I'm not weird.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it reveals another level, like that common thread of humanity, right?
Yeah.
And when you start to talk about your collections or the things you like, and you realize like most of your friends would be like, what the fuck? And then you'll find 3 people that are like, oh my God, I do that same thing.
Yeah.
And it's just it's just soothing to know that.
Yeah. And that's what I love about what you're doing is like, at the end of the day, it's about humanity. It's about stories. It's about people. And this stuff that, like the weird stuff that we just brought with us along the way, I just love it. It's just like a little piece of what makes living on this planet interesting. I love it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been, and I'm sure this happened for you too when you started your show. You have the idea, right, of where you're going, and then the show takes a life of its own, right? And you just kind of, it unfolds itself in the way it's supposed to. And I always have people that'll go like, I don't collect what this person collects, but I found it so interesting. And they'll listen to a story of somebody that they probably wouldn't sit down and have coffee with, or they wouldn't, maybe go to their house. But then they'll hear that same thread of like storytelling and humanity and compassion. It's been really beautiful. I'm so grateful for the people that sit down and share their stories with us so candidly about how and why and where they collect or what started them. It's truly magnificent when I sit and think about it.
I imagine it's somewhat therapeutic for them. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially after the last year. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it leveled the ground of podcasting last year.
Yeah.
Everybody was home and everybody was at the mercy of Zoom.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So if you could get them to talk to you, then
yeah. You're like, here we go.
Yeah.
Not doing anything.
Let's talk about your creativity. You talked about letting the show kind of having a life of its own. How do you interact with your own creativity? Is it when you view it in your head, what do you see?
It's a good question. When I read it over in those questions, I was like, oh, what does it look like when I'm creative. It's generally like a burst of inspiration, or I feel called to do something. Every week I write something on the show called the estate sale walkthrough, and I base it off of items that the guest has told me about before we record and their social media. And I just kind of go through, and I've tried to like write it based off of certain aspects, but it always happens the same way, where I sit down to write it and the ideas start to pour in, and then I get these like bursts of like intrusive thoughts of where it should go.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, all right, I'll look that up, or I'll go this way, and it'll change like the course of it. And that's generally how there's generally not like a solid set plan. It's like a huge burst of like being pushed in front of a freight train of like, this is the direction this has to go. Let's figure it out.
Yeah.
And so with any type of creativity that I do, I start with a general idea, a real loose idea, and then it forms itself. It kind of leads its own path that I just have to follow and get it to where that's at. And I am my own worst critic. And there's of course, sometimes I'll make something and I'm like, you could have done this. And if I overthink it, or if I make too much of a plan, I'm generally not happy with what I've created.
Yeah. Did that take time, or did it just kind of come organically?
I think a little bit of both. I think the biggest lesson in learning that was probably behind the chair and being at the mercy of what's on top of somebody's head and having to roll with it. Like, you have a general idea of where you're going, like especially in the realm of like fantasy and bright hair colors. Yeah. You're really at the mercy of the hair and what they've done to their own hair. And so you have to be flexible. You kind of have to go like, this is the direction we're going, but we're going to have to be creative in the outcome. And that's just kind of how it's rolled into like my entire life. Like, I'm a last minute person until the day I die. Like, I work much better under that like final hour, with whether it's making Christmas crafts or anything like that. It's just like the last bit is where I get the best stuff. Where if I worked on it over the course of a month, I'm just like, nah, it's whatever.
It's so stressful in that last minute though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a problem.
I've never thought about, doing someone's hair kind of like improv, but what you just described is like, I come from like, I did some improv when I was younger and stuff like that. But I love the idea. It's like how, like, I want to live my life is like being engaged and not over planning, and I never thought about the challenges of someone comes to you and they have the hair that they have. So you have to like accept them the way they are. Mm-hmm. And then they want something special from you. That's such an interesting task.
And yeah, it is. I'm glad I've done it for as long as I have, because now there's some things that will tip you off into them maybe not being wholly honest about their hair. Okay. And I think a lot of the dishonesty behind the chair comes from hairdressers that shame their clients for using what they can afford. And so they hold back in telling you because that stuff can all affect how your hair takes color, processes color, does anything. And so when somebody sits down, I just go, tell me the last 5 years of your hair history. I don't care what you use and I don't care what you put on it. But in order to get to the place we need to be, I just need you to be honest. And if you're not, I'm going to know, especially if we're lightening your hair. Like, it's going to become very apparent. I said, so in order to save you some money and to save us some time, just give me the list. I'm not going to give you a grief for it. Yeah. And then they're like, okay. So then I get the hair history and then I'm like, oh, no, we can't do what you wanted to do today. Your hair will fall out of your head. That's not going to work. It's not. And I lead with like maybe too much honesty behind the chair. I explain everything that I'm doing to somebody in detail so they understand what's happening on their own head. And I just am brutally honest. Like, I'll just be like, no, this color is not going to look great on you. And if it's something that I know is not achievable, I just won't do it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then how do you, like, have you taken that kind of approach into podcasting? Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Because it's just like, no matter my best efforts, it's only going to be what my knowledge level is or what the capacity is. Yeah. And I just kind of have that, like, fake it till you make it and just do the work that you know how to do the best right now and just let it build on itself. Yeah. And, hopefully that will show. Yeah.
Do you deal with any anxiety or getting in your own head or anything like that?
Yeah, especially before I had like the right diagnosis. I would be so incredibly anxious before and leading up to an interview, like almost debilitating, of just in my own head so much about it, right? And like when I first started, I always have a silly putty that I hold in my hands to keep my hands busy. So I've been messing with it the whole time. Just finding ways. I've always kind of dealt with anxiety and those types of things. So finding ways that make it manageable. But now that I'm on the right path of my own stuff, I haven't had that happen. And it's been really nice to not feel that level of like sometimes crippling anxiety. And like I would do an interview and then Jill would leave and I would just have to go lay down for a little while. I would just feel so tapped out. And I think obviously a lot of people don't know that because it's not, it doesn't come across that way, but it was. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to even hear you say that because like, if I take a step back and look at this whole conversation, I'm like, she was like tailor-made to do this, right?
Oh, thank you.
Talking to people, like doing hair, getting their stories, being like, and I found, just as an aside, your approach to talking with people and being sensitive to like what they could afford to do with their hair is so refreshing. And so like, obviously I haven't like dealt with that because I'm not dyeing my hair and stuff, but just in terms of just being like, you know what, people do what they can afford and just being not a dick about that. That's really nice. So when I hear you say all this stuff, I think, why you don't seem like you would be nervous because you're very direct. And I feel like, oh my goodness, I could learn something. She just gets shit done. I'm like spending a day being like, oh God, what does it all mean? Why am I having an existential crisis? That was yesterday. But then to hear like, this is what I'm doing. I'm playing with silly putty during it. I'm crashing after. And I've had the post crash and be like the next day I'm just so depressed. And I'm like telling my wife, I'm like, I don't know what's wrong with me, but I feel like shit today. And I had a great interview yesterday. Why did those two things don't make sense? But here we are. And it's refreshing to hear that. I didn't expect that as I came into this.
Thank you. It is a heavily honed coping mechanism to be the one that seems
that's all it is, right?
Super confident, and the one that seems like she's got her shit together. Because it's, and behind the chair, right? You can't like look like you're nervous. You can't look like you don't know what the fuck you're doing. Yeah. But it just comes from, childhood and it maybe being a little bit of an outcast and just going like, all right, I got to put on some personality that makes me seem a little untouchable. And that was just what I did forever. I then, the last year just got over like, I just really don't give a fuck if somebody doesn't like me or not anymore, which was a huge turning point. But yeah, the post social crash is still a thing. I still get like, okay, and I got to lay down and deal with some stuff. And I always, one of my favorite quotes from a podcast I used to listen to a lot from the last podcast on the left was Marcus Parks says, your mental health is your responsibility. Like you are responsible for making sure that you're doing the things you need to do to live and to not let that leach out onto your close friends and family. Cause it's like, you may be in a shitty spot and you may be really struggling with this stuff, but it's like, you got to take those steps to figure out your own shit. Cause it's your responsibility.
Yeah. I love it. Thank you so much. Like that. Yeah. Thank you for sharing all that and being so transparent and that. Yeah. It's been really enjoyable just to connect with these things that, I don't get to talk about very often. And it seems like maybe you don't get to it as much either. What's your favorite thing to make?
Oh gosh. There's a couple things that instantly come to mind. I love to garden. So my favorite thing to do is to plant a garden and watch it grow and see what it looks like at the end of the year. But my next favorite thing is every year I make what's called a putz house. And they are little paper houses that people have for like Christmas or holidays. And they're teeny little miniature and they're just kitschy and they're covered in glitter and that you can do all these little details. And every year for Christmas, I make one or two as presents and I set up a table in the basement. It becomes a glittery, gluey nightmare. But I'll sit and I watch this show that they do in the UK every year called the Big Fat Quiz of Everything. And I sit and I watch it and I do that and I just get lost in it and it's so nice. That's probably my favorite thing to make.
I'm gonna have to look these things up. And after this, I have I don't know what I was gonna do this afternoon, but I'm definitely check out some thrift stores because you gave me the bug. I'm like, I gotta go see the wear out on half of a spatula or something.
You do, and you got to remember to look under the tables and on top of the shelves.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good tip. Do you have another tip for me?
Another tip I would say was to make at least 2 laps. Because you're gonna miss something the first time.
Okay.
And buy it because you like it, not because it's gonna make you money. If you look something up and you're like, this is selling for XYZ, just buy it because you like it.
Do you ever, question for you, do you ever buy things do you ever have a false memory of buying things?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Like you're like,
All the
oh,
time.
so for the movie things for me, I went looking for a movie I swore I had. My son swore we had. It doesn't exist.
I either blame it on that or like the borrowers that are like take it from me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I do that all the time, and I just have sometimes like zero object permanence, and so I will have in my brain carried something all the way to my bedroom to like plug it in.
Yeah.
Or I like will do something, and then I get to another part of my house, and it's like my brain has been erased. I'm like, where the fuck did I set that? Or like, especially after I had my kid, like I was putting shit in the fridge that didn't go in the fridge, like my remote, my cell phone. Thank God for Apple technology of like find my shit, because now I'll just be like, I don't know where the fuck I put that. It's all the time. It's all the time.
I just got a notification on my phone that you can find it when it's off now, and I was like, oh, thank you.
Thank God. Also, my phone's never on ring. If my phone rings, it scares the shit out of me.
Yeah, for sure. Something's wrong if your phone's ringing. Like, what? Who touched this?
Yeah, it's and I have an Apple Watch now, which is nice when you're recording because it'll get you like a little blip, and so I like my phone really is just there to like take pictures and scroll TikTok. That's pretty much it.
Sam, thank you so much for talking with me today. It has been so delightful, and I'm like, you totally gave me that antique vintage bug now.
Oh, thank you.
I'm gonna go spend what little money I have on stuff I don't need.
Please send me pictures. You can always talk to me about it.
If you ever want to talk, like if you ever need someone who has a decent movie collection and wants to talk, I would love to. Because even as you were talking now, I was like, oh, we're going to get into some uncomfortable stuff about why I've been buying these for
We should do that. We got to set something up to have you on.
I'm game. Yeah. Whenever you're ready, I'm there.
Thank you. This was an absolute delight. It's always fun to talk about the things, and I love your show, and I love that you're getting to the bottom of, the same kind of thing that I am, right? Like what makes you creative? Why do you do this? Mm-hmm.
It is the same kind of stuff. It's like I love seeing people just light up when they talk about the thing that they have to make.
Yeah.
It's just like, well, that's everything right there. You just did it. That's the thing that wakes me up in the morning. It's like, oh, I want to make this thing. And when your brain turns on like that, it's the best. So thank you for sharing that with me.
Thank you. This was lovely.
Samantha's great, isn't she? Man, I really respect Sam and the way that she approaches her work and their podcast. She's another one of those people who left me, after our conversation a little shooken up, like in the best way again. I really appreciate her straightforward vulnerability. And even in the edit, when she was talking about, avoiding her shittiest work and stuff, I was like, oh man, she's right. And like, when she said it, I was like, I don't think that applies to me. And in a few weeks since then, I was like, oh, I've been there. Sam, thank you for joining me on the podcast this week. Thank you for your podcast, for your perspective, and for sharing your creative journey with us today. Also, guys, if you were wondering why my audio was so bad in this episode, is because it was my first time using the new mics over Zoom, and I totally beefed the setup. So I'm so glad that Sam was so professional. I actually used her audio, but that's why I sound like whatever. Alternative title for this episode could be I Have Your Face on My Phone. Today's episode was produced by me, Ryan Leacock, with music by Matt Large. Special thanks to Aaron from Him and Her. Thank you to you for listening, dear listener. If you like this episode, go subscribe or rate. You can follow us on social media. Great People Podcast. Have a good week, guys. Enjoy your Halloween. Show up and do the work.